So yes, we are going to record the panel discussion for those who can't be here. People are really curious about this. So I'm going to ask everybody, all the panelists, to come join up here. Just sit down, and then I'll bring your name tag, and we'll briefly introduce everybody, and then get going in the conversation. Just please sit wherever. I don't necessarily want it to be in age order, generational order. So sit next to somebody you don't know. There we go. And I know all of you, so I can bring you your name tags here, so everyone can know who you are. I think there are more chairs than. So it looks like we have one microphone that is working well, so we're going to probably have to pass it around unless we can figure this one out as well. So as part of this, thank you. As part of, thank you. These last few months, as we're working on One Congregation, Many Voices, we've been looking at the difference in generational cohorts based on really 3 categories. One was the environment, one was gender, and the third, Judaism. And we're really going to focus this panel much more on the Judaism, knowing that the differences that we might have among the age cohorts on those other topics actually do play a role and an impact, and have an impact on people's opinions. We also know that there are many other differences among us that might have nothing to do with our age. They may have to do with our gender and our life experiences, our education, the communities we live in, socioeconomic levels. Many different things make differences. And so we do also understand that the answers that people have are not going to be that this person represents their entire generation, that they are a unique person as well. And so each person will speak from their own particular perspective. But we thought having a large and rich panel like this might help us to have the conversation of understanding what are people thinking about, what are people concerned about, and what does it mean when we talk about, which has been the buzzword in Federation world for many years, Jewish continuity, right? That we want the next generation to be Jewish, but it's not just to be Jewish to have the label, but actually that there should be some content to that Judaism. What does a Judaism look like? What are the Judaism that we're living? How are we practicing that Judaism? And so this is a little bit what we're going to be exploring together on this panel. So the first thing I'd like you to do just is to introduce yourselves, however you'd like to do that, in 30 seconds, your name, something about your family structure, anything you think that you just like to share as an opening remark about your relationship with Beth Emmet.
I'm Brad Zacharin. My family and I have been members, I think, going on 15 years. My wife, Amy, my sons, Sam and Henry, who are 14 and 11. We've gone through a few life cycle things here and have more to come.
My name is Ezra Hilton. I grew up here at Beth Emmet, and now I'm back as a member, and I think that means my kids are 4th generation, technically. So at Beth Emmet, and my wife is putting her face in her hands with the applause, but we can keep embarrassing her, that's okay.
Hi, my name is Sam Zuckert. I grew up here at Beth Emmet, and I was living out in Boston for a while, but I recently came back to Chicago, and it's been very nice to reconnect with the Beth Emmet community.
I'm David Zarefsky. My family and I have been members of Beth Emmet for 43 years, going back to the early 80s, shortly after Rabbi Noble arrived. And I've been involved in mostly adult education and related issues, and have served in the officer rotation some time ago now.
The past president, not just one.
I'm Laura Miller, longstanding Beth Emmet member. Several of my family members are here, and I feel like Beth Emmet is also my family.
Hello, my name is Tony Maidenberg. My wife Jenny and I moved here to Chicago 4 years ago. been members of Beth Emmet for 3 years, and we're here to remind you not to take any of this for granted, because what we have here is not only a wonderful community, but a stunning array of educational opportunities and the capacity to do good things. So as we wrestle with all these larger issues, don't overlook what we all have and enjoy.
All right, Tony's going to do PR for us now. Thank you. Beautiful.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Graham. I am the daughter of Lizzie and David Graham, the oldest. So my dad is a past president here. My family has belonged to Beth Emmet, I think, for 60 years. In total, maybe a little bit less. I'm looking, where's Barry? There we go. Okay, it's in 67. And so this is truly like a second home to me. I am married to a non-Jewish person. We have two kids. We have twins. They're 6 years old. And I wish that I could come to Beth Emmet more often, but I can't afford to buy a house in Evanston. So if anybody is looking to give a house away, that's why I'm here today. All right, thank you. Here.
Well, if somebody would clear out their basement of stuff, there would be room for the for Hannah and her family. Wonderful. So as part of the preparation for this time, we put online 2 chapters from this book, Tablets Shattered, plus some other material. Who, don't want to embarrass anybody, we're just kind of curious, like who actually read the introduction and the conclusion to this book? Excellent, okay. And who actually read the whole book? Yeah, the whole book. And what I found really fascinating was we put those 2 chapters up, and then people actually read the book. Last fall, Ezra Hilton and I were having a conversation about the book, and I said, I don't know, Ezra, I don't know if there's anything that's really interesting in this book. It's probably old stuff that I know. Joshua Leifer, here I am being a bit of a snob. He's 30 years old. I'm like, he's 30 years old. Okay, you know what? What can I learn from him? I know he's a good writer. I know he's a good thinker. But you'll tell me if it's a book worth reading. Well, Ezra's got 2 small children and didn't get a chance to read the book. So I said, okay, Ezra, I'm going to buy it and I'm going to read it. And I bought it and I absorbed the book in I think a weekend and found it to be really amazing. So I said, okay, Ezra, I'm going to make you read it now because I read it and it was worthwhile. And I hope that others have found so as well. So at the beginning of the book, in the first chapter, he talks about 3 pillars of American Judaism over the last 100 years. And he talks about American Judaism from 1924 to 2024, 1920-24 being the year of the Immigration Exclusion Act, when the number of Jews coming to this country began to diminish because of the immigration quotas. And then through last year, so he was thinking about the century of American Judaism. And he said 3 pillars were Americanism, liberalism, and Zionism, that those were key to understanding who we are. Americanism being that we all wanted to assimilate and be part of American culture and believed in this country. Zionism, that was an important pillar for us, that we looked to Israel for inspiration, that we supported Israel through our dollars, and that was an important part of Jewish communal life. And finally, liberalism, that we realized being part of a liberal community was beneficial to Jews and to others as well, and that we believed in those principles. And that what we're finding is that actually those are beginning to crumble in the Jewish community and in the American community in general, as we have seen. And so he concludes his book by saying that there are 4 different ways that he sees Judaism being practiced today, and he shows some of the strengths and weaknesses of each of those. And I'll just quickly say what they are. The 4 are what he calls the dying establishment, prophetic protest, neo-reform, and separatist orthodoxy. What he means by the dying establishment are the major Jewish organizations that developed in over the last 100 years that were raising money for causes in Israel and here, that those were pillars of who we are in the Jewish community, and that for many in the next generation, that not really being responsive to the needs, the interests, the political perspectives, and that those institutions have become dinosaurs. Prophetic protest. He talks and he critiques his own generation that has spent a lot of time in the streets protesting many policies over the last 10 or 15 years, both here in the United States and also in Israel. And he said there was a great deal of strength, that our generation felt very strongly that we had to get out there and our Jewish fellows needed to be in the street. And at the same time, then we'd go back to our apartments, and there was not much Jewish community that continued to develop. And he critiques the prophetic protest movement as not really developing any community. Neo-reform. What he meant by new reform is not just the reform movement, but all of the liberal parts of the Jewish community. That neo-reform was about bringing politics into our Judaism, and the importance that we saw that our Judaism shouldn't just sit within the synagogue, but needed to be out into the world and speaking to the issues of the world today, and that some ways that was really powerful. But the problem with neo-reform, whether it be in a reform or reconstructionist or even a conservative congregation, is that it was much focused on the individual. The people had their choice. I step in, I step out, I do what I want, that there wasn't necessarily strong communal commitment and involvement. And finally, the last one is separatist orthodoxy, which he talks about having the strongest communal engagement with each other. But the problem with separatist orthodoxy is the chauvinism that had developed and the xenophobia and discrimination against people outside of the community. So he really talks about all four of these as having as still important within the Jewish world, and people being engaged in one or other of these, or sometimes more than one, but also the downsides of each of these. And then he actually talks about, for him, what has become important is a traditional form of Judaism. And he is observant Jewishly, but also liberal politically. And he believes that that's the key to where we need to be in the next generation. So I didn't know if anybody had any comment or critique about how Joshua Leifer set this up. If you think that one or the other is where you are, that he's right about this, where we might need to go forward in order to have a strong Jewish community.
Since I brought up the book originally, I guess I can also start off here. I did finally read the whole book. And I think the whole book is worth reading because it tells such an interesting story of how we got to where we are today. And I don't know if that necessarily means we can figure out where we're going, but I think that I'm going to say very personally, identify very closely with Joshua Leifer. I think I'm very similar in my outlook, in terms of my relationship to the Jewish community, in terms of my politics. I've followed him on Twitter when I was still on Twitter for a very long time and read his writing. And I think that his argument is very persuasive in that I've always felt that the Jewish community in sort of outsourced Judaism to Zionism for a long time. And that's the thing that spoke most powerfully to me, because I want to feel connected to the community. And as my generation feels more and more ostracized from Israel, we want to stay connected, and yet it's very difficult. And so I think that that the chapter on Zionism, which was earlier in the book, was one that I read the most closely and thought was really worth going through. So in terms of these four types, I think that what speaks to me is the sort of communal aspects of the Orthodox community, which is what we're all kind of searching for, while also maintaining the sort of liberal values we've grown up with. And what that brings to mind for me, and again, speaking from how I trying to be in my personal life, is bring back the traditional beats of Judaism and almost separating ourselves once more and being cognizant about how we're different and celebrate those differences with our fellow folks here in America, while also saying, we're going to celebrate Shabbat, we're going to take Fridays, and we're going to be together as part of our community. We're going to celebrate all of the holidays and not just show up on the high holidays. And I think people are searching for that community, but it's hard to find.
I have so far read only the introduction and conclusion of the book, although I plan to read the rest of it. But they suggested to me two different takes on the notion of age-related answers to these different questions. I mean, one is to say we're at a certain age in our lives, whether it's getting married or having kids or this or that. And the That I have not found to be terribly persuasive. And in our discussions this afternoon, it seemed to me that most of the similarities and differences, at least that we identified at our table, were not really related to age. But the second dimension of age related is experiencing things at a particular time or a distance from them at a particular time. So the reason that Zionism is dying off, according to the analysis of the book, is not because people are a particular age, but because the nature of our relationship with the state of Israel is not the same as it used to be. The reason that the Holocaust is no longer the motivator for Jewish communal participation is that our connection to the Holocaust is diminishing. So it's age in relation to ongoing cultural and political and geopolitical events in the world rather than chronological age per se.
I'm thinking about this in a couple ways, particularly because I'm a professor of education. I'm specifically a professor of middle school education, and I think a lot. I have a PhD in literacy instruction, so I think a lot about kind of how do we pass on these things, even for me, to younger generations. And one thing I always laugh at whenever we're watching the news and we're seeing, people say, "Oh, well, they're teaching kids this, they're teaching kids that." I always laugh because you can't teach kids anything. Okay. You can't force them to learn anything. And when I think about kind of uh, culture and how that's passed on and the like Lador Vidor aspect of it all, there seems to be this line that's being drawn between being Jewish and practicing Judaism. And I think that so much of my generation has been nominally kind of Jewish, like I am Jewish, but our sense of what it means to enact that is so different than the generations that came before. And it makes me think about the kinds of skills that are necessary in order for younger people to engage in Judaism in the kinds of ways that actually we would like maybe people to engage with as the people of the book, as a more traditional way of engaging. Because I've always said that I am looking for a place where I can be. I lived in Israel. I did a fellowship called Dorot, and I studied at Pardes, and I was also engaged in going to the West Bank and working with Palestinian activists, right? Both of those things, it's really hard to accommodate both. And I think that the kinds of skills that are necessary for us to re-engage in examining texts and getting critical. I am in 50 middle schools right now, okay? Kids don't want to read. They simply don't. And so figuring out how to maybe shift some of our own educative work, and this is mostly for my generation, to focusing on the skill building of engaging critically, the chavruta, is actually vital, not just the content. Because I think what is so special about our tradition is the questioning, right? So how can we bring it back to not, you must do this in order to continue the tradition, but the tradition being rooted in the questioning, which we know, so much deep in our hearts. But that was a sort of winding response. But it really, he talks about in that last chapter that, we're so concerned. He talks about Americans being kind of averse to reading. And so I could not stop thinking about the kinds of skills that we might embed as a cultural value that we pass along.
I think what you said about the difference between being Jewish and practicing Judaism, or not the difference, but being Jewish versus practicing Judaism is pretty relevant to a younger generation, especially Jews who grew up like me, fairly secular, even though in the synagogue, lead a Jewish, if secular life. And because I think a lot of and that's kind of caused some tension. The way you practice Judaism has caused some tension between younger Jews and the Jewish institutions. And the institutions are really helpful. Jewish institutions are really helpful for practicing Judaism. Gives you the framework, gives you other people, gives you that community. And I think a lot of us grew up with a Judaism that was sometimes mockingly, sometimes endearingly, like Tikkun Olam Judaism, where Judaism was like, it was kind of the surface, not the surface level, but the Judaism of the Torah. But then also there was another type of Judaism, which was the Tikkun Olam notions of the morality and then making a positive change in the world, repairing the world. And I think for a lot of us, that became how we saw practicing Judaism, was the Tikkun Olam notion. That was our Judaism. You know, the specific religious observance was less important to our lives than the Tikkun Olam notion. And I think a lot of the institutions recently, big Jewish institutions, have really become disconnected from a lot of the ways that a lot of young Jews practice Judaism, in the sense that we don't feel they're really, you know, participating in that Tikkun Olam as we see it. I think a lot of big Jewish institutions have, you know, kind of, people want to see their institutions align with the way where they want to practice Judaism. And if for, you know, someone, their Judaism is about civil rights and about peace and about helping, you know, policies that help the poor and, you know, help the sick and all of that. And we see institutions that are either, you know, remaining neutral or oftentimes cozying up with political actors that are opposed to those notions, we feel. I think makes it very hard for young Jews who see their Judaism as that to connect with those institutions.
So Sam, based on, what you've just shared with us, what do we think Jewish practice in synagogues should look like that be multi-generational? What does Jewish practice look like? Anybody want to take that one? No, Sam's going to come back to that one. Okay, since you started it. Yeah.
I think for me, especially, I think the institution, especially a synagogue like Beth Emet, if you look at it, the life cycle, you know, it's great when you're young. And then, you know, it's great all through high school. And then you go off to college. It's kind of like, all right, you fly like a butterfly, and then you eventually come back. And then you're a young parent, and it's great because there's, you know, the preschool and the opportunities to the community. And then you age, it kind of goes through. And then as you're a parent and all of that, there's other great opportunities. What it kind of misses is, I think, that people in my current, you know, 22 to 32 who are less likely to have kids right now, or maybe, you know, all people are in America are less likely to have kids in general. And so how do you keep people engaged at a synagogue when they're a young adult working in the world, probably lives in the city, and don't have kids? And what is that like? How do you engage with their practice of Judaism? And I don't need to offer like I don't have any specific examples of what that might look like, but finding a way to really keep people reconnected. Because I think someone like me, I went off to college in Boston. I lived in Boston for a while. Now I'm back in Chicago. And I think a lot of people, you know, you disconnect from a synagogue for 10 years, and it's not always easy to come back without a specific reason to, especially if I have kids, if I have kids soon, hopefully, and then they can go to preschool here. But before that, you know, what would my role at the synagogue be, and how does a synagogue, especially, I mean, in a suburb, like we said, Evanston's not cheap to live in right now for young people. So how does this synagogue, continue to draw people in and not, can keep people engaged when they're in that kind of the middle, when there's not that program that already exists for them?
I'm going to detour a minute to tell a little story that we'll get back to the question, because it gives a little background. It's about a literal light bulb moment about differences between generational perspectives about things. We grew up living right next door to paternal grandparents. And sometimes when my mom was home alone, she'd get a call from grandma saying, I see that there are 2 lights on in different rooms of your house, and you're only one person, so you're wasting electricity. Please turn off the extra lights. And of course, this was like deeply irritating to my mom. The difference was my grandma, fled the pogroms. To her, the path to security and to, the ticket out of poverty was to be very careful and frugal. To my mom, who grew up in a tenement in New York and watched, Hollywood movies in the branch house, the ticket out of poverty to security was glamour, being Americanized, leaving behind those immigrant ways. So they're very different generational experiences led to very different ways of looking at the world. But underneath, they were looking for the same existential thing. They were looking for security. They were looking for stability, for belonging. So when we look underneath to those big existential questions, meaning, belonging, community, birth, death, etc. That's where we find the commonalities. And looking all around this room at everything all the different generations said, that's where I saw the commonalities as well. So in terms of expressions of Judaism, that's when people really turn to religion. Secular life just doesn't help us that much with those existential questions and dilemmas. Judaism very much does, as long as you can hear it speak. So we have to find, just like Hannah was saying, ways to have it speak. And just one example that I can give that I've seen really successful is in the Chevra Kadisha, the group that does Tahara, the ritual for Jewish burial. Very multi-generational, lots of young people involved, very deeply involved in this deeply meaningful and kind of complex ritual. It speaks to that existential need and it engages people. So I think we need forums in and outside of synagogues and other institutions to speak to what really matters to people the most.
So I just want to talk about where I am in my life. I am in a 2-income household. I have to work. I love my job, but it is very demanding. And I have twins, right? That are in kindergarten. So I think it's really interesting to be at this point in my life and recognize the amount of support that I need, both financially and in care, right, in order to engage the way that I would want to engage. And so one thing that is true that, about when it comes to the Orthodox, when it comes to Hasidic Judaism, there is a built-in community there. There's a built-in structure. And I don't know how to remedy that in Reform Judaism or in other communities that are a little bit more secularized, right? But I just want to point that out as a serious issue for like people my age that feel deeply connected, but don't, and by the way, don't call my parents, okay? They're okay. They're babysitting, I promise. But the having just that built in, it just would do something, I think, to have that, that time element.
And I'll follow up on that a little as well, since we also have a kindergartner and feel that a ton. When Rabbi Len, you posed this question to us via email a couple weeks ago, the one thing I wrote down in my mind is the question also becomes, what's been constant in the Jewish community? What has strengthened the Jewish community for 2,000 years in the diaspora? And how do we adapt that to our lives, our modern lives now? And so much of that is community. And when we went through all of the various posters, the word that came up often was growing up in the Jewish community, having a strong community. And how do you re-knit that back together is a really interesting question. Providing babysitting is a great way. But I think also part of that is making the synagogue a place where everyone always shows up. And when you show up, there's always people of a similar generation to you and older generations and everything. I think one thing that was really amazing about our community retreat was that we had people from every generation there and everybody was having a great time together. And how do you encourage that? We've brought our kids to Shabbat services recently, and we've been the only people with kids there. And it's both wonderful and sad because we're the only one with kids there, but it's great because everyone's happy to see the kids. And so how can we encourage everyone to show up at all times and have the synagogue become that community center again, is the sort of what I think we need to move towards, that place where everyone can always feel at home.
I'm going to pick on Brad here for a moment because he hasn't said anything yet. But, Brad, you're kind of also in between. Your kids are a little bit older and you've had your participation through Beit Sefer in other ways. what do you think that we are doing or not doing to really help families be Jewish and to be part of this? And what has been most significant in terms of the Jewish practice and the Jewish education for your family?
So for us, a lot of it began right in this room doing Tot Shabbat with Rabbi London and Kathy. And that is such an important point of entry because for those of us who don't have the privilege of being, fourth generation families at Beth Emet and grandparents need to fly in for a weekend, be able to have them come to Tot Shabbat and see, okay, this is a great place. The rabbi is here. Like there's these wonderful plush Torahs, which I don't think we had that technology when I was a kid. Um, but it is an important gateway because you feel like you're doing something productive and it builds that momentum of being in the space, getting comfortable, with a young family. And I think Beit Sefer is also really important. As I remarked at Cantor Kotler's farewell, our younger son, Henry, would just start singing a lot of the prayers he was learning at Tefillah, like on the car ride home and in the bathtub, which was the part he didn't like me sharing publicly. And so, the importance of Beit Sefer is the kids start to feel Jewish and they do things that allow you to have conversations where you can have grandma pull out, the Seder plate I made out of asbestos, however many years ago it was. And, these things play out in different ways in different times that are organic, but it requires some of that intentionality for people to make the time, find the time, and easily make the connections. Another thing that I would just mention that's like really important and I think bears explicit reference is there is really good Hebrew education in Beit Sefer. And for me, growing up in a conservative synagogue, knowing how to read Hebrew, knowing prayers, it's important. And, the Tikkun Olam aspects are very important, of course. But I think, the familiarity with liturgy, being able to stand up in front of the congregation for your Kabbalat mitzvah, was important to us when our older son recently did it. And, we look forward to our younger son doing it. And I think it's something that Beth Emet does really well and is something that you may not realize it when you're in the moment. But for those of you who have children as adults at Beth Emet, or for those of you who have kids at Beth Emet now, I think if you really think about it, you'll realize it is quite critical.
I would also add that community is something that can be built. It's not just a natural phenomenon. I had an experience that was the opposite of many of us. One of the poster boards said most of us grew up with mostly Jewish neighbors. I grew up with no Jewish neighbors in a non-Jewish section in a city that had a relatively small percentage of Jews at the time. And the community that was built through the synagogue and its activities and programs. It wasn't built through relatives that were close by. They were thousands of miles away. It wasn't built by natural phenomena. It was built intentionally.
Just add a couple of thoughts. Our roots are in a small Indiana town where the Jewish community was always small. We never had a full-time rabbi, never had a full-time staff. We had almost a 100-year relationship with the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and we'd have a new student rabbi every year. So our constant was change. Nevertheless, most of the kids who grew up, went through Sinai Temple in Marion, retained their Judaism, certainly not on as much of an academic level or even spiritual level as what we're sensing here, but it was enough for that kind of generation to participate in the major issues of the day, which we thought were part and parcel of what our Judaism and the prophets particularly were all about: civil rights, anti-war efforts, and so forth. Couple of practical things just to keep in mind. One is particularly as we get ready for the presentation by our treasurer on the way forward financially as a collective family, I think it's awfully important to try to make temple membership as affordable as possible to younger families particularly with kids. Those are the years, the critical years that we want to plant those seeds. Just a quick commercial there.
Adam will be proud of you in it. Yeah. What do you think it would mean to truly co-generate, meaning to tackle challenges within our Jewish community by collaborating across generations? I mean, you can see to make this happen, we really had to work really hard to recruit people of younger generations. And how many did we get after that recruiting? 7, right? And it is one of the things that happens here. I mean, Ezra's right, that you show up for services and you might be the only ones there with your kids. So what does that look like for us? And what do our practices look like?
So one thing that there's a feeling that comes over me when I walk into this building, and it is one that is both familiar, like putting on a really great old, pair of pants, but also one that is like, oh, now I need to be very serious, right? There is something about this space that feels adultist to me in a way. And one thing that I just want to say is that if you go to like a conservative or an Orthodox, ceremony, or if you go to Shabbat services, there are kids screaming. Okay. Like there are people in the background moving around. And that is honest to God. When I lived in Israel, I loved going to those services because they felt so multi-generational and enlivening. And perhaps I'm sure there's a history here that I don't know in terms of the anglicizing of the way in which our services are run. But I truly wish that it was more of a space where there were people just running around all over the place. That's all that that's it.
Let the laps begin.
Well, I guess to underscore the importance of co-generating, I think that's sort of the whole essence of Judaism, that it's all about this ongoing conversation among the generations for thousands of years. What we're doing when we're looking at Jewish texts and reading Torah and studying is we're having those cross-generational conversations with our ancestors. When I have the super great pleasure of mentoring 12-year-olds who are trying to write their devars for Kabbalat Mitzvah, I would say that it's at least mutual mentoring. No matter how many other grown-ups I hear perspectives about the Torah portions from, or how many rabbinic commentaries I might read, the uniqueness of the perspective of the 12-year-olds I work with is just astonishing. It's like a whole different breath of fresh air. So I think it's absolutely crucial to pay attention to the kinds of things you're saying, Hannah, the practical obstacles, the sort of cultural, institutional barriers that might be invisible, sometimes very tangible, like dues, and sometimes invisible, that get in the way of that, because that's the crux of what's important. And it's also important because in those dialogues, in the text, there's so much about contemporary issues that we so desperately need wisdom about. There's all sorts of things about, for example, how to fight tyranny and oppression, why not to have a king, how to fight economic inequity, even like neurodivergence and how to deal with that is in there. All sorts of stuff is in there, but you have to like be able to hear it. And we have to find spaces, again, inside and outside of synagogues to have those intergenerational discussions and then put it into action.
Ezra was just saying, how do we cross it? Like, how do we bring it back, right? Well, you have to have people in proximity. And in order to do that, you need to make it as easy as possible for everyone, right? And in order to establish those loose ties that are absolutely crucial to rebuilding.
For me, the most successful example of cogeneration is the Passover Seder.
How would that play out?
Well, I mean, there's often an intergenerational presence. There's different degrees of intimacy represented at the Seder table. There's supposedly a dialogue that takes place with the kids who are at the table so that the liturgy of the Seder is translated into their own experience and their own ability to understand. It combines storytelling and song and scavenger hunt and all kinds of activities to keep everyone involved and interested. And you come out of it with a better understanding of the tradition and its continuing relevance.
I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction here because I can finally drop this quote that I have. I was listening to the Chris Hayes podcast this week on recommendation of my dad, even though I usually listen to it. And if anybody's interested in zoning regulations, I highly recommend listening to the Chris Hayes podcast this week. He was interviewing a journalist who wrote a book on zoning named Yoni Applebaum, and he dropped this great quote, which was perfect for this week, which is generations tend to respond to the problems into which they are born. And that's something that I'm going to kind of hold on as to how do we co-generate. Everyone has their own sets of issues and they respond to what has happened to them in that point in time. And a chance to remember that and respond to the issues of the day, so long as we keep that in mind and respect that everyone has their own perspectives because of what they were born into, that gives us a chance to, kind of build a platform from which we can go from there. I also just want to say that the Seder is a great metaphor there as well, or example of cogeneration.
And since I'm passing the mic back, I'll just quickly add what I had in mind around this question was the notion of humility in working across generations. And I think that's come out in a lot of the comments. I mean, for Hannah having a rabbi who doesn't care about a baby crying in the back of a service, or working through a Seder, as David said, in ways that can talk to the youth as well as the adults in the room, or recognizing that the problems of your youth might inform what you do with your career. It really matters. I won't go into the details, but the congregation I grew up in used to have two campuses, one sort of northern part of Miami where the older people lived at that point, one in the southern part where my family lived. And ultimately, there was a schism because the younger people who had the kids in the southern area had a different thought about various political things that I only had so much insight into because I was a young kid, but a lot of the debates were happening in my household as negotiations were happening. And over time, what became clear as I got older and heard a little bit more of the story is people were just locked in to generational perspectives, and it just broke down. And it's a sad thing to have a synagogue, a congregation split in that way, but without that humility, I think we make bad decisions, and we do one of the things we really can't afford to do as a community, which is needlessly lose people.
But how easy it is to do that when we're not willing to listen or be open to people, right? Laura, one of the things that you mentioned as being so powerful as be involved in community is the Chevra Kadisha and people who are involved in Taharot and preparing those who've died for their burial. And You know, one thing that I have found as a rabbi over the last 29 years um, is that people feel like they're more likely to be involved if they feel like they have a purpose, if they feel like they have a place in a community. Tell me about what would that look like to have people feel like they had a purpose and a place within the community.
Um, well, my immediate association is to many churches where people come in and part of their joining that church community has to do with figuring out what their ministry is. You know, how do their particular talents and skills fit with what that community might need? And what would give them joy in terms of, you know, bringing their skills, talents, and interests to the larger community. And one of the tenets that's central in Judaism that perhaps we don't pay enough attention to is exactly that secular society is that ethics are very much built along rights. In Judaism, very much centers on responsibilities, not only individual but communal responsibilities. And if we had that sense of sort of joyous in many cases communal responsibilities, like what would give a person meaning to give to the community, people might really feel like they had a clear place.
Okay, so now I'm going to pick on the young people on the panel to say, so what kind of communal responsibility or obligation do you feel like you have towards Judaism? Do you feel like somebody would like you'd like to have thus ask you to have?
Well, the first thing that actually came to mind for me was participating in tefillot and specifically reading Torah or having Chance of an Aliyah or things like that. It's a, you know, yeah, right. Well, I mean, I basically, you know, now I'm on the list for high holidays, and it's like, okay, it's, you know, I'm willing to do it, but can somebody else take a turn every once in a while? But maybe I should show up on Shabbat, yeah. And giving people that sense of responsibility is really interesting. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who recently chanted at Kahal, and he thought how great it was the chance to do that, and that he'd want to go back. Somebody who's my age and his kids around our age too. And so I think that's it. Really, it kind of comes back to getting people into the building and giving them that responsibility. And then you show up for your friends as well. You know, if I'd known my friend was chanting, I maybe would have tried a little harder to get there for that. So I think that that's kind of an obligation. And maybe that's the first thing that came to mind for me. So.
So the obligation and responsibility, I guess, to a community, it depends a lot on, you know, what size of the community, what scope of the community is. You know, I think a lot, if people are not connected to a synagogue, then like, when I think about like, what is my responsibility to Judaism or the Jewish people as a whole? I mean, I think about that a lot and I don't have a good answer. I guess in general, it's just like, you know, be a nice guy and reflect well on the Jewish community. Like, you know, don't encourage anti-Semites through through nefarious action. So yeah, to have an obligation to a community, you need to feel like you're part of it, right? And so for a community like a synagogue to have that obligation, if people have left and haven't come back or never weren't attached in the first place, I think um, feeling an obligation to that is going to be very difficult and very remote. And David, like you said about communities are, you know, we would love for just community to kind of naturally appear and everyone to come and it'll be great and it'll work itself out. But that often doesn't happen, especially when there's certain, whether it's, you know, demographic or economic trends that make it more difficult. And it seems, I guess, kind of crass to me to talk about like, oh, then like, what are the incentives for a person to come? But really, you know, when someone's thinking about their connection to the community, you know, it's like, what do I give and what do I get? Right. And that it's a calculation we all make, whether we think about it or not. And if you have, you know, a community that's much more isolated, it's kind of like, well, what you get is you don't get socially isolated, or you like, that's kind of, you get that your neighbors and your family don't look at you weird. But for, I think, a community like Beth Emet, which I think is very, would be very against putting social pressure on people, like reacting negatively to someone through a social way, which I think is great. It's a great way to treat people, but it makes it difficult that kind of like, makes it difficult to see what they should give and maybe difficult to see what they can get. And so when you think about bringing people back to a place like Beth Emmett, I mean, I think people are definitely willing to give. People are looking to give, people love to give. But kind of how they fit in, like you said, like what is their purpose? And it may be, in what they get, because if what they get, then they can continue to give on. And you think about the power in generations. How do we co-generate? Well, there's a lot of power in our older generations, so older, more experienced, more, I don't know. Sorry if this is a silly semantic point to get harped on. It's only making it what I'm saying worse. But there's a lot of wisdom in this room, right? And a lot of experience. And I think a lot of young people would really value that, whether that's in how to live a Jewish life, how to live a good life, a family life, career, nuts and bolts things like, well, what do I pay for rent? How do I find a good apartment in this city? How do I buy a house in Evanston, stuff like that. And I think if there's, and we would love if that could happen naturally, right? If people would just connect and bond, and that would be great. And it's great when it does happen, but we might need to be more intentional about that, about reaching out to people and saying, hey, listen, this is what we can offer, and not in words that not in words that plainly, but say, hey, this is what we can offer you. We would love for you to come and be part of this community. And then also saying like this, and this is what we would love from you to give. I think, like I said, people are willing to give to a community. It feels good. It's especially the Jewish community, a Jewish community, to be part of that. So kind of just like letting people know what they give and what they get, I think is a way again, it feels crass, but it's a good way to build community, because then that's how you get people in. And once they're in, they get connected. And that is, you got to be intentional about it, but hopefully it can be something that can then grow naturally. Once you have to plant the seed for it to grow, right? So thinking about that.
I think we heard from Sam and Hannah is that we need to find them a house they can afford, provide babysitting, allow space. I love crying babies, and your kids coming and crying, and I'm also just willing to take them on the bima and hold them, whatever it takes. We love that. We also, I don't know if you knew this, Hannah, in our reconstruction, there is a room right next to the sanctuary called the Beit Midrash, which we also call it the crying room, so that if people felt they were uncomfortable in the main sanctuary, they could also go in there and hear the service, and there's toys, and it's really wonderful. I love looking over in the middle of services and seeing kids playing with the toys there, and families feeling really comfortable. So, but you're also allowed to be in the sanctuary. I don't care. I love the noise. I love that about traditional community as well. Well, this has been really extraordinary to hear all of your wisdom. We're about ready to wrap up here, and I know that we have many more things we want to talk about. And as a matter of fact, we're going to be in our next topic talking about differences in the community, about opinions around Israel, Palestine. Part of that's generational, part of it's not, and I hope that we'll continue with that conversation when we get into that even harder conversation in our community, and how important it is to talk about the difficult conversations, the difficult opinions and differences that people might have on these issues. But before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance. Is there anything that you really wanted to say, and I didn't ask the question because we didn't have time for all the questions? Something that's burning that you feel like would be really helpful for you to say. A lot of people brought notes and other things, so I just want to make sure that I allowed you to say what you were really thinking, what was really in your heart. So, anybody have something like that? No. Adele? Okay, we can ask one question and then we'll finish up. Thank you.
We're very new here, and I wonder who follows up on all of the very bright and interesting and creative ideas that have been put forth today.
All of us. And I'm serious. I'm a little bit serious about that because I think in order to create community, each and every one of us needs to feel some responsibility for what we've heard today. That we can't say, oh, it's the rabbi, it's the leadership, and that people need to do that. The communities that really function really well, it's not 1 or 2 or 10 or 20, but it's hundreds of people who say, yeah, that's me. I hear that. I got to find Hanagram a place to live. Because that's important, because I want Hanagram to be not whatever it is, and so Skokie, thanks, and Skokie is also a place to, right? these are eternal conversations, and there's different ways in which to think about this. I find that one of the things, and I've been here at Beth Emmet for a long time, 25 years, and we sit around the board table, and believe it or not, in the 25 years that I've been sitting around the board table, we've had the same conversations hundreds of times. Sometimes people say, we talked about that last year and 2 years and 10 years. And what I have found, frankly, is that there's not necessarily a magic bullet to any of these things or a magical program. And I do find people say to me, Rabbi, I have the answer. And I was like, oh dear, when I hear the answer, then I get very nervous. Because there's multiple ways. Because creating community is a dynamic process, and it's about listening, it's about growing, it's about struggling, it's about trying, and it's about failing. And so I think that all needs to continue, and that's what part of this year was about, is trying to continue that process of struggling and trying and failing and understanding. And I think that what we've heard from our panel today is just how powerful our Jewish tradition is, and that there's so many resources right there within it. And can we continue to mine those resources, dig into those resources, and also at the same time always be reaching out and bringing other people in. You want to know how you get people to come to services on Friday night? When's the last time you invited a friend? That's when they come. Why don't young people come to services? Because they come and they're the only people there, and then they don't want to come back again. But if 10 people come, but how do you get those 10 people to come? Well, Ezra calls this person, who calls this person, who calls this person, who calls this person, who calls this person. Why are these people here? Yes, I called all of these people. I reached out to all of these people, but I'm one human being. When's the last time you reached out to somebody you didn't know? Invited them to do something here? Somebody of a different generation. Do you know what that would look like? Can you imagine if everybody in this room invited somebody who wasn't related to them and they were a different generation to an event? It would completely transform what we look like. So the answer, I really am serious, Adele, is all of us. And I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I love that we started this conversation, and I love that you asked that question as we continue forward. And I really appreciate the tremendous openness, love, wisdom. I knew all of these folks would have that, and I'm glad they were able to share it with all of us. Before we leave today, we are going to do Havdalah to say goodbye to Shabbat and welcome the week of work. I'd like to invite Debbie and Karen to come up also, my wonderful, amazing co-chairs who have been working so diligently on this program for the year, and they are amazing. I just want you to give Debbie and Karen credit for this terrific program. And we will be following up on all the things that people said here and getting back to people on that information. But I would like to give Debbie and Karen a final word before Havdalah.
I'm happy to have the final word. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. I especially want to thank those people who are facilitators of salon groups. If you're facilitating one of the salon groups, can you just sort of wave your arms with great pride? Thank you. Because we all know if you're in a salon group, how great that is to be part of it. I'd also love to thank all the panelists. Thank you for your time. Amazing insights. Really, I've got a whole bunch of notes, Adele, so we won't let these ideas fall aside. I certainly want to thank Becky and Jody and Pierce for the logistics that go on behind the scenes, and Michael, who had to make a lot more chairs appear, which is wonderful. We're going to have Havdalah in a moment, but two other things I want to make sure people know about. The third module of this year, as Rabbi London said, is going to be focusing on Israel, Palestine, Zionism, just easy topics. We will probably be getting that information out within 2 weeks or so. I know everyone's eager to be processing that, but we'll get that out to you as soon as it's ready. We're kind of just in time. The world's kind of changing quickly, so we're trying to get resources that are very current. And finally, before Havdalah, if you don't have dinner plans tonight, we're going to Pita Inn. And it's an easy, big restaurant on Dempster, if you are the one person who hasn't been there. Everyone buys their own dinner, and we can just hang out. So if you don't have dinner plans or only have a couple minutes, please join us. And if you can't, that's also okay. Zero agenda, but just continuing the conversation and connections we're making. Anything I missed, Debbie?
Thank you for your presence and and conversation and all the questions and energy that you brought to this room.
Abdallah, yeah. So please gather around. If you'd like, you can stand up or stay in your chairs, whatever you're more comfortable. But please join in singing as we bid farewell to this wonderful Shabbat. Just was thinking, it began last night with Rabbi Emily Dana, who grew up in this congregation, giving just a tremendous Devar Torah about what it looks like to be an inclusive community. And then this morning, we continued at our Shabbat morning worship service, talking about Truma and making donations and building community and what it means to build together. And so it really primed us for this afternoon, and then having a lovely lunch. And then I think Danny and I walked home, fed our cat, and put our coats and walked back here. So we really have felt this wonderful embrace of community, and it's wonderful to have this kind of full Shabbat experience together. So please do join in Havdalah. Ya la ya la 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 ya la ya la 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 ya